Going to talk about the all important office of the vice presidency. Well, okay, over the course of U.S. history, it has not been the most important office. In fact, there weren't many provisions for duties of the vice president other than to take over the president and to serve as president of the Senate. Those are the only to take over for the president in the case of incapacitation or death, or be the president of the Senate. But over time, the vice presidency has evolved, and we're going to look at that briefly here. So you can pause this video at certain intervals to get the notes for 13.2. Okay, I'm going to hide my fat face so that we can get into some more information. So the original provisions of the Constitution didn't necessarily provide for a succession. They said that the duties were to devolve on the vice president. Okay, so up until 1967, when the 25th Amendment was passed to declare the vice president shall become the president in case of the removal of the president or his death or resignation, then officially become the president. So up until that time, we just had the duties of the president devolving on the duties of the president devolving onto the vice president. So you had several instances where presidents were assassinated, Lincoln, or died in office, Benjamin Harrison. So where the vice president had to take over, but they up until this time they weren't really. I mean, it was done by unofficial tradition, but they decided after the assassination of Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office on Air Force One with Kennedy's body in tow, that they needed to make this a little bit more firm. This 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 succession. Previously, they had made the succession of the order of the who would take over if the vice president were incapacitated or died or was removed. The Speaker of the House, no matter even if it's the opposite party, the Speaker of the House, then the President pro tem of the Senate is next in line. The President pro tem is the most senior member of the Senate, services in the President in absence of the Vice President in the Senate, and then the Secretary of State, and then each of the 14 heads of the cabinet, in order of precedence. In other words, in order of how they were founded in the Constitution. That's what we're looking at. How does the 25th Amendment provide for situations in which the president is disabled? So I've got how does it provide for ideas of the president disabled? So the vice president is to become acting president if the vice president is to become acting president if the president informs Congress in writing that he's unable to discharge the powers and duties of office, or two, the vice president and a majority of the members inform Congress that the president is incapacitated. I will tell you that number two here was a kind of a possibility with Trump at the end of the 2020 election, where there was some concern about his mental state and the vice president and the majority of the cabinet invoking the 25th Amendment. But there's a long process with that, where there has to be an investigation and a congressional body that has to certify that, and also a two-thirds vote of Congress, which would be almost impossible to get. This is not the same as impeachment, where the House brings up impeachment and the Senate votes on articles of impeachment. They did impeach Trump for crimes against the presidency that were related to January 6th, but that didn't come to fruition as far as conviction. But there have been many instances where over the course of since this has been passed, the 25th Amendment, 1967, that there have been many instances where the vice president has informed Congress in writing that he's unable to discharge powers due to his office. Interestingly enough, it's usually if you're going under some sort of sedative. Several of them colonoscopies or just surgery to remove something, a quick in and out thing. And then, of course, when we had Nixon during Watergate, Gerald Ford had to take over, and that was the first time we actually had to test this presidential succession. And Gerald Ford took over and then had to appoint a new vice president in his place. There's been several times where this is actually taken place. So in December of 73, um, basically, excuse me, August of 74, um, basically the next day, August 9th of 74, Ford was sorted as the president of the United States. He actually was sorted as vice president in 73 because of Spiro Agnew's having to resign because of criminal accepting bribes, evading income taxes, and so on. So this is how the 25th Amendment has evolved. Now, to preside now here's a couple of, and I already mentioned this, a couple of formal duties of the president other than of the vice president, other than taking over the to preside over the Senate in cases of a tie, but it's ceremonial. He has no vote except for in cases of a tie, or he or she has no vote except for in cases of a tie, and to help decide the question of presidential disability. So that could be, that's another factor. We already talked about that. Pence had the unfortunate duty to decide that in the wake of 1/6, and also to take over to be next in line for the presidency. So who can the position of the vice president be considered? Both very, why can the position be considered both very important and important? This is a, well, no pun intended, important to understand. They're only a heartbeat away from the presidency, but there's really not many duties that are like the president has. We'll get into this. President has many hats that are worn, and many duties. But many vice presidents throughout the course of history have really had little to do. It wasn't until the last 40, 50 years or so that we've evolved the vice presidency a little bit. Um, a lot of times it's to balance the ticket, meaning to choose a running mate or candidate for vice president who can strengthen the presidential candidate's chances with certain ideological, geographic, racial, ethnic concerns. So obviously, the first woman vice president, Kamala Harris, first African American woman vice president. That let's be honest, it was a demographic choice. Going back to like Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson was a Democrat from Texas, and he was picked because he was they're trying to get the Southern vote. Um, there's many instances of balancing the ticket. Biden was a balance for the more traditional Democrats under Obama, when Biden was vice president. Now, how has it changed? So starting around about, I would say Al Gore. I would say Al Gore. Even George H.W. Bush under Reagan, but Al Gore, especially under Clinton, they've began to take more duties, take responsibilities. Al Gore was given certain responsibilities regarding taking early action on climate change that unfortunately didn't come to fruition. And Dick Cheney under George W. Bush took a lot of action regarding national security and the Iraq and 9/11 affairs. He had a lot of experience coming in. Dick Cheney had been previously a congressperson and Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush, so he had a lot of experience there. And then of course Biden had quite a few formal duties. So recently the office has become much more formalized, where the president has recognized that the office of the presidency is a very involved place, and he needs the help of the vice presidency. Ford filled this nomination for a vice president. How does the procedure to fill vacancy, who must be confirmed majority votes of both houses? Ford had to go through it, and then Ford's vice president, Nelson Rockefeller, had to go through it to be able to be confirmed by a majority vote of both houses of Congress. And Rockefeller was sworn in as the new vice president, but it took 4 months to confirm his nomination. So it's like basically like to confirm a nomination for the vice president if it was vacant is basically like confirming a cabinet member. Essentially, is this? It's kind of going to be the same process. So that's a little summary look at the vice presidency. Especially important is the passage of the 25th Amendment and how the vice presidency's duties have evolved over recent years and have become much more significant and meaningful, as opposed to just being a ceremonial position to preside over the Senate and be ready to take over if the president dies or is incapacitated or removed.